Good morning, students. This video is for class 6 science, and today also we will discuss with friction. Today also we will discuss with physics, and the topic of discussion will be friction. So, what do you mean by friction? Friction is that force, it is that act which actually stops any moving object. So, when you are cycling, when you are running, the force that is actually stopping you from falling down, or maybe from the force that acts on the surface of your foot to stop you, to oppose you, is the friction or frictional force. We have seen that friction or frictional force is the resistive force, that means the act of stopping you, acting between two bodies that are in contact. Friction acts on an object when it moves over another object with the surface in contact with each other. So suppose when the friction only comes into play when you have two surface acting on the same face. That means when you're cycling, the surface of the road and the surface of the tires, they they are in contact, and frictional force comes into act between these two surfaces. Friction is a contact force and depends on the nature of the surface in contact. So friction will come into play when they are in contact with each other, when the surfaces are in contact with each other. So that is why it is known as contact force, and it depends upon the more the roughness of the area, the more the roughness of the road, the more will be the friction. So suppose if you all must have been to the shopping mall, you will see the floor of the shopping mall is either they have put tiles, or they have put marbles. So the surface is very smooth. So when you walk on them, you tend or you feel that you will be slipping down because the surface is very smooth. That is why the amount of friction is very less. So more the roughness of the surface, more will be the friction between the two surfaces. The roughness or smoothness of the surface determines the extent of friction. So it is the roughness or the smoothness tells you how much friction is involved in that. If we observe the contact surfaces of the objects through a magnifying glass, we will be able to see a lot of irregularities or hills and groups on the surface. So if you see the surface with a magnifying glass, you will see there are very irregularities. They are not smooth. That is why friction comes into play, and that is why you have a lot of grip onto that thing or subject or object. These irregularities exist at the microscopic level even for a fine smooth surface. When one surface is in contact with another surface, the irregularities on both the surfaces get locked and produce an obstruction to the relative motion between them. So, if you observe them very carefully under the microscope, you will find very irregularities. That means they are not smooth. So when these two surfaces, when they are in contact, when they roll over each other, these irregularity surfaces, they interlock with each other and they prevent them from moving. When the two surfaces are rough and have more irregularities, the interlocking is more and the friction is more. So if the surfaces are rough, the amount of friction will also be more. For example, pushing a box over a rough surface. On the other hand, if the two surfaces are smooth, irregularities are less. So if the surfaces are smooth, the irregularities, the curvedness of that surface is less, and that is why friction is also very less. Hence we can reduce friction by making the surface smooth. A ball can roll easily over a smoother floor as against a grass patch. That means we can easily reduce the friction by making the surface smooth. Now suppose if you roll a ball over a smooth surface, the ball will roll over a longer distance as compared to the rough surface or the field where you have lot of grasses. Friction is also dependent on how hard the objects are pressed against each other. A heavier object is pressed harder on a flat surface compared to a lighter object. That means an object which is heavy, it will exert more pressure, and that is why friction will be much more. So if you push this, you will need less effort, less force to apply. But if you move a very big object which is heavy, you need to apply more pressure. and because of that friction is more. Hence its motion over the surface is slower since the friction is more. Now the types of friction. One is the static friction and one is the kinetic friction. Static friction. If we push a table gently, the table will not move. So if I push this table with little effort, with little force, it will not move. The friction acting between the table and the ground prevents the table from moving. So the friction acting between two surfaces in contact when there is no relative motion between them is called static friction. So when you apply a force and the object is not movable, it does not move, it does not make any movement, that is known as static movement, static friction. That means it does not allow the movement of the object where you push or pull. If you keep on increasing the applied force on the table, you will feel more opposing force, and after a limit the table will start. So slowly and slowly, if you increase the amount of force you apply, you will see after a certain limit you will be able to move the table. This indicates that static friction increases with applied force. So the static friction, it also increases by the amount of force you apply. If you apply more force, the static friction will keep on increasing. So after a certain limit, you will be able to move that object. If the applied force is increased further, the static force does not increase beyond the maximum level. The maximum value of static friction between two surfaces in contact beyond which one surface starts moving over the other is known as limiting friction. So the maximum, after a certain limit, static friction will not work and the object will be able to move. That point is known as limiting surface. That means you have overcome that. Static friction has already overcome and the object is able to move. The next is the kinetic friction. Kinetic friction comes into play when one object moves on top of the other object. Now consider a football rolling on the ground. The ball comes to rest after moving some distance. This is due to the friction acting between the ball and the ground while the ball moves on the ground. The frictional force acting between two surfaces while there is relative motion between them is known as kinetic friction. When there is no motion, it is known as static friction, and where there is a motion, the force that acts on the moving object, that is known as the kinetic friction. That means it is because of the kinetic friction that the ball will roll for some distance and it will stop. Kinetic friction can be classified into two types. One is sliding friction and the other is rolling friction. Sliding friction is one object, the two surfaces in contact sliding, one object will slide over the other. And rolling friction will be the object will remain still, but you put one more, you will keep one surface, the down surface will keep on rolling and you will move the object. So let us see. When an object slides over a surface, the friction acting between the surfaces is called sliding friction. And what is rolling friction? When an object rolls over a surface, the friction acting between the surfaces is called rolling friction. And remember that the force exerted by rolling friction is less than that of the sliding friction. So I hope you have understood. In rolling type of friction, the friction is much less as compared to the sliding friction. So children, I hope you have understood this types, what is friction and kinds of friction. Today we will keep it till here. In the next class, we will read about the effects of friction, its advantages and disadvantages. So children, for today up to this much. Thank you class.